it comes out of a really dark moment in American history. Um, During the First World War, when thousands, tens of thousands of African Americans are beginning to move from the segregated South and reconstitute communities in the urban industrial North. Uh, it's the call for a Black History Week. Initially, it would later become a month. Also comes up in an environment where we see rampant discrimination, Jim Crow segregation, racial violence, and being in the context of the First World War, racial violence here as well as abroad for many African Americans who enlisted, upwards of 400,000 to fight uh, in the interest of the United States abroad. So it's a very sort of tumultuous moment. It's a very dark moment, but it's a moment full of optimism as well. Many of those migrants who settled in places like New York, Detroit, and Chicago came with new hope and expectation in terms of their destiny and possibility in these new places. I mean, this is an era, really, when we think about it, this is an era where we see the creation of these modern, urban, Black communities. Places like Harlem, Bronzeville in the south side of Chicago, Newark in New Jersey, Paradise Valley in Detroit. These are when these urban industrial communities are beginning to flower, but these are communities that are the result of rampant discrimination in these urban industrial centers. They're formed due to discrimination in housing. And so folk, almost as a consequence of circumstances, are left to build these communities, which in a short period of time become home to institutions and organizations like the NAACP, like Black churches, Black schools, Black businesses, institutions and organizations that people develop a strong connection to. And the movement to recognize the contribution of African Americans to American society emerges in that context. It doesn't emerge in the South, it emerges in Harlem, in New York. And the sort of inspiration for that movement comes from intellectual by the name of Carter G. Woodson. And he was sort of a pioneering figure. It came about in 1915. He sort of called for a celebration of African American contributions over the course of a week. A little sort of background on Woodson. Woodson was a graduate from Virginia, segregated Virginia. Quite phenomenal in terms of his intellectual prowess. Goes to the University of Chicago to do undergraduate work, where he focuses primarily in history. And then he moves to Harvard University and becomes the second African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard University. And he relocates to Washington, D.C., and he moves between D.C. and New York. And he's really, I think, dedicated to this project of commemorating the contributions of African Americans to American society, primarily because within the larger historical profession, nobody was talking about African Americans as being contributors, as having anything worth sort of chronicling or documenting in regards to the American story. And Woodson began to trailblaze a whole new sort of line of inquiry in the tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, he's part of that sort of generation of intellectuals. It's through him that we get this sort of call for a commemoration. And then he organized during the height of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. He organizes an organization that's still with us to this day, and it was originally called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and it became, a few decades ago, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And he also started a journal. It was originally called what is it called? The Journal of Negro History, and which comes out of the organization, and it is now called the Journal of African American History, and it's probably one of the premier journals relative to the field of African American studies and African American history, particularly. But Woodson was really about chronicling, preserving, promoting the study of African American life and culture, and he connected that activity to the broader social and political struggle for African American respect and recognition, for rights and citizenship. Because I think he firmly believed that by showing African Americans as significant contributors, it would change the way in which they were seen as citizens and would work to bring down those barriers of exclusion. So he's very significant in that regard. And that's sort of why we honor his memory today. Wrote a wonderful book, if you're interested, Miseducation of the Negro, where he sort of deals with this theme of the role of education in sort of breaking down or challenging ideas about race, the barriers of racism in our society, and you know, many people, made their names through publishing in those journals. But yeah, Carter G. Woodson was quite phenomenal, and his book, he's most well known again for Miseducation of the Negro, which is an important book, dealing with the function that education plays either to alienate folk or to make folk feel as if they can be considered as included in American society. Very important work. Much more can be said about Woodson. I can speak quite extensively on him, but an important pioneer, and he's actually referred to colloquially as the father of Black history, just due to his pioneering contribution to the preservation and the advancement of that project. Yeah. That comes up quite a bit. It really does depend on the school itself. When I was coming up, it tended to be rarely celebrated or acknowledged when I was in high school. I don't want to date myself, but I was a child of the 80s. So, when I was in high school, those things, it was given, the African American experience was given relatively scant attention. But as I deal with students year from year, I notice that things are beginning to change, and that people are learning a little bit about the African American experience. And again, I think it really does speak to maybe the schools that students are coming from, the quality of teachers in the classroom, and curriculums. The schools that many of these teachers come from, and the emphasis that they place within the curriculum to promoting the teaching of this experience. It really, it's getting better, but there's a lot of work left to do. And this is just based on my interactions with students and their sort of preparedness when they come into my class, and it tells me a lot about where they come from. And it really is uneven, which is both very sort of hopeful, but also illustrative of more development in terms of building curriculum at the K through 12 level. I mean, at the core of teaching courses in African American studies, in the area of African American history, African American culture, I mean, at the center of that is really sort of a reflective contemplation about how race and racism has played so much a part of the American experience. And, when students come into the class, very early on at the beginning of the semester, there is this level of discomfort among some, and really sort of maybe unknowingness. And to some respect, which I find really interesting, some students have never even really thought self-consciously about race or racism as a system in their day-to-day lives. So taking these kind of courses forces that kind of critical reflection, and and people do move through it in sort of meaningful ways, questioning their own assumptions, questioning the assumptions that were instilled in them from their parents and community and churches and all this other wonderful sort of influences, and arriving at a point where, by the end of the semester, where they feel more informed, where they have a level of critical ability to think about things that they've just previously just readily accepted without question. Um, so, you know, and I love to sort of facilitate that process within the context of the classroom. So I do think we are making progress. I think students come into this from all different backgrounds and comfort levels. Um, uh, but honest and open dialogue serves to bring down some of these inhibitors, um, and respectful dialogue, and where we actually do sort of learn from one another about ourselves, about the society in which we live, and maybe even our visions for the future, where we want to go as a nation. So I think that that's some of the wonderful things that come out of these courses. Yeah. Ooh, that's I just recently, a community organization which holds these monthly discussion groups. It's an organization based out in Franklin, Kentucky. Uh, and every month they have these sort of round table discussions about race. And recently they contacted me, and they asked if I would sort of facilitate this month's discussion. They go around and talk to professors across the country to see how these professors could sort of lend some insight on questions that come up every month. And this month it was like, why do we have like a Black History Month? Why do we need separate Black institutions or complexional institutions, separate churches, schools? Why is there a need for that in the 21st century? And my response is really drawn from earlier generations of folk who really studied this question in deep and meaningful ways through going into Black communities and sort of chronicling, documenting the world that folks created, these churches, these schools, these neighborhoods. And I'm speaking specifically to an important work that was carried out by two sociologists, one by the name of St. Clair Drake and another by the name of Horace Caton. And it was a book called Black Metropolis, which was published in 1945, and it was focused on the Black community in the south side of Chicago called Bronzeville. And that was a question, like, how did this community form in 1945, in the 20th century, at the time when America is fighting a war for democracy abroad? Why do we have persistent segregation and discrimination in America? And I think that was the central question to this entire study. And what they found was this community, the institutions that were created within this community, this was a result of rampant discrimination. But these institutions, organizations, both religious and voluntary, were essential for helping folk organize their communities, their way of lives, to give people a sense of belonging, a sense of citizenship. Think about it. Not having some basic privileges, not having basic citizenship recognition, not being seen as a equal member of society. That really does impact the psychology of folk. And within these institutions and churches, and I'm not just talking about 1940, we go all the way back to the era of the American Revolution, to the creation of the first Black churches. These separate institutions give folk a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. It gives them a sense of citizenship, a sense of nationality, in a world where their nationality is circumscribed by race and racism. That these institutions are still with us speak to their importance within the longer history of the African American experience, these organizations, voluntary associations and institutions, but also to the persistent problem of race in American society that can't be ignored. It had nothing, I mean, we have come a long way, but there's still so much far we have to travel. And these institutions serve a critical purpose in terms of reinforcing um, a positive sense of self, a sense of belonging, particularly among poor folk, working class folk, in a lot of these urban communities. Um, and they begin to sort of express, embody, reflect the concerns of these communities to this day. Concerns about, particularly if you visit urban communities across the country, issues of police brutality, issues around employment, housing, and other aspects of discrimination and inequality that folk experience on a day-to-day level. So they serve a function that's very meaningful and in the lives of African Americans over the long array, now and probably well into the future. I think it was I was a history literature major in college in Amherst, Massachusetts, or Western Mass, and they were just a vibrant community of academics in that area. John H. Bracey, who's written extensively on African American protest traditions. Ernest Allen. At one time, before I arrived there, James Baldwin, the famous African American writer, was there. Michael Thelwell, who's written is an important Caribbean writer out of Jamaica. Who else is there? So many people. The list is quite endless. But I actually had the opportunity to sort of take courses under really incredible professors who looked at the American story from a different vantage point, and I found that very intriguing, and that there's so much to be done in terms of reflecting on our past, the connections not just here in the United States, but also across the globe to other communities. I mean, that's an area I'm definitely interested in. And my current work is a work of biography that looks at the relationship of this guy, St. Clair Drake, to social movements across the globe. His whole life sort of cuts across the diaspora, and his involvement in many sort of intellectual and political communities over the course of the 20th century. So in a short sort of way, I mean, it was people that I came under as an undergraduate that sort of inspired me to pursue this training in African American studies. And secondly, I'm the son of missionaries. I lived all over the place as a kid, in the Caribbean, in Europe, all over the United States. And so, through that, I've, engaged, encountered diverse ranges of communities. And I've always sort of been intrigued with the suffering and the experiences of marginalized populations. My father is of Caribbean descent, my mother is British. And so a child of that, coming out of that sort of experience, sort of, I think, naturally forced me to question things, to have an affinity for or an awareness of the margins in a way that maybe a lot of folks don't have. And so it sort of naturally moved into that as an undergraduate, and that's the story. It just worked through to now.